As someone who took the bar exam just last year, I actually get quite a few questions about whether the LSAT or the bar exam is harder. Which exam is harder? It's the question that so many people seem to have. Ultimately, chances are, if you're in the US and you want to become an attorney, you're going to have to take both of these tests at some point. But before I get into which one is harder, let's talk about the differences between the two tests. The law school admissions test, or the LSAT, is the test that you take to actually get into law school, as its name would suggest. This is a standardized test that pretty much every law school applicant takes, and it adds some consistency into the many different applications out there because you have all sorts of different majors applying, people from different backgrounds, people from different careers who are applying to law school, and you want to have some sort of standardized, consistent element in there. At least that would be the argument. The LSAT itself takes about 3 hours, but to actually go and take the LSAT will probably take more like 4 hours because of all the administrative stuff where you have to plug in your name and all this stuff that takes forever and takes precious energy when you need it for the test, but whatever. It's about a 3-hour test. We'll call it 3 to 4 hours. And I do think they've started to streamline some of that administrative stuff in recent years, though I haven't taken the LSAT in a few years, so I can't be too certain. But I know the test has remained largely unchanged. And we can start to compare this to the bar exam, which is a much longer test. My test took 2 days. I took the universal bar exam, which is what most states administer. And that's a test that typically has something like 6 hours of actual testing, plus breaks on top of that, and then that's typically split over a couple of days. So it is a very long test versus the LSAT, which is just one little day, one little afternoon, and then you're done with it. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. The bar exam is much harder than the LSAT. And there are a number of reasons for this, which I'll get to, but just to explain what the bar exam is, in case you're unfamiliar, this is the way to get admitted into the actual bar for a particular state. And this is to allow you to actually practice law in that state. So you have the LSAT, which is the admissions test into law school, but then you have the bar exam that you would take after you graduate law school to then prove that you're fit to actually practice law. At least that's the idea. I would say that's highly debatable that that's what the test is actually doing, but that's the idea and that's what you have to do. So long as you can pass the bar exam and you pass some other sort of background check sort of things, then you are fit to practice law. You are allowed to, you're admitted into your state's bar, and then you can start practicing. So anyways, what makes the bar exam really, really difficult is that you have to know a ton of stuff. It is a very knowledge-based test. Now compare this to the LSAT. The LSAT is a skills test. You don't really have to bring any substantive knowledge to the table. You just have to be a pretty good reader and be very logically oriented in breaking down different reading passages or their very infamous logic games. It's very skills-based. You're not going to be able to memorize your way to success on the LSAT, which can make it pretty frustrating to actually train for and to get ready for. But then when it comes to the bar exam, there's just so much to actually cover. It's not as simple as just doing a few flashcards. We're talking about months of very hard studying to memorize some things, to really lock down or refresh other things that you should have learned in law school and maybe you didn't, and then this is your chance to learn them. But you have a lot of sort of short-term memorization going on, ideally some long-term as well, so you actually remember these rules, but it's a very intense amount of material to cover in a very short period of time. And then you have to be able to recall that, perhaps unprompted in some cases, when it comes to the actual bar exam. That's not to say that the bar exam doesn't have skills involved too. You do have a pretty significant writing element in the bar exam, which ideally is something you'd also learn in law school. So that really shouldn't be all that unreasonable to expect from someone who passed law school. You should be able to write at a decent level to where you can actually pass a bar exam, at least from that perspective. But you're still gonna have to recall a ton of different laws and different concepts that you're gonna have to bring to the test. So in that way, training for the bar exam, I think, is a lot more straightforward in that you just have to really learn a bunch of material. So however that works for you, that's what you should be doing. Whatever allows you to lock in the most information possible is probably what you should be doing. You can focus on the areas that you think you're lacking in and really work on memorizing those sorts of laws and rules and all the things with that. And ideally, you'll be sort of interested in it too. Who am I kidding? I wanted to be a real estate lawyer. I knew I was going to be a real estate lawyer as I was hired to do that. So when I was taking the bar exam, really, I did not care about 90% of the material that I was actually studying for because I wasn't going to use it in practice, and I probably never will. Now, of course, things could change, but frankly, you're not going to be an expert attorney in any area based on what you learn for the bar exam. It's pretty shallow but broad in its actual content. That's really more of a critique of the practicality of the bar exam. You could argue that the LSAT isn't very practical either, and whatever. It's just all about standardized tests. There are all sorts of different problems. But anyways, the LSAT is not only a much shorter test, but you don't really need to bring a lot of knowledge to the table. And you're gonna have a pretty good idea of what you're gonna get on the test if you do a few practice runs beforehand. Probably more than a few, maybe even a couple dozen if you're pretty extreme about prepping for it, taking many different practice tests. That's what I did, and that's how I raised my score by about 15 points from start to finish, so it was a big improvement. But it really did start to plateau after a certain point because, again, it's a skills test. And once you kind of figure out sort of the mechanics of the test and you get used to that and you start building up some endurance, it's going to be very hard after a certain point to really get that incremental improvement on your score. So in that way, the LSAT is a bit harder. I think it's harder to actually improve your score after a certain point. But when it comes to test day itself, I think it is a much easier experience. To put it in perspective, when it came to the LSAT, I probably prepped for something like 60 to 100 hours. Not sure exactly. I didn't track all my hours, but I did take a number of practice tests, and all of those were around 3 to 4 hours, probably closer to 3. So multiply, say, 20 tests by 3 hours, plus reviewing all of those sections and reviewing problems I got wrong, we'll just round it up to 100 hours. But fast forward a few years to when I had to prep for the bar exam, I took a bar exam course, which I definitely would recommend doing. But that was something like 4 to 5 hours a day on average for almost 3 months. So that's a lot more than what I was spending on the LSAT. So if we assume an average of around 20 hours per week times around 12 weeks, we're looking at well over 200 hours. And that's probably quite on the conservative side. I was probably much closer to 300 or even 400 hours, especially in that last month where I was doing more like 8 to 10 hour days for those last few weeks, and at least a few times, actually 7 days a week. Prepping for the bar exam can very easily become a full-time job. You could make prepping for the LSAT that intense as well, but you're probably gonna be beating your head against a wall after a certain point, so it depends on what you wanna do. But in any event, if you take an intentional approach to your preparations for both tests, you should end up doing well. In the case of the bar exam, you should pass. In the case of the LSAT, you should get a decent score. You definitely want to do a fair share of practice problems going into it so you know what to expect, so you know what your problem areas are that you can actually focus on in your practice. Then you should find yourself in a very good position. I, for one, am definitely happy to have both tests behind me. I don't want to take them ever again. They're not fun. And then that's why it's very important to actually put your prep work in beforehand so you don't have to keep redoing these things over and over because it's not fun. Or maybe you're into pain, in which case, go forth and conquer. But in short, the LSAT is hard, the bar exam is harder. At least for me, though your results may vary. But otherwise, if you liked this video or found it helpful, definitely like, comment, subscribe, all that great stuff. But until next time, take care.